and welcome to AFI Docs. And this panel of History is Out of the Closet, Excavating Queer Stories for the Screen. I'm Sarah Harris, the Director of Programming for AFI Festivals. So while our team was piecing together the festival program this year, we noticed a theme coming together: stories of forgotten figures or communities that have often been overlooked or ignored by history books. Today, we're here to celebrate Pride and dig a little deeper into a few of the films in our program. I'm so thrilled to have our filmmakers present today, and I hope you'll engage in the conversation with them on the chat. And now, to moderate our Docs Talks panel, I turn it over to the Executive and Artistic Director of Queer Women of Color Media Arts Project, Madeleine Lim. Madeleine, take it away.
Good morning. I am joining you from San Francisco, which is based on unceded Ramaytush Ohlone land, so it's still morning here. I'm Madeleine Lim. I'm an Asian woman with brown skin and short hair. I'm wearing a lavender shirt in honor of Pride with a purple bow tie, and there's a bookcase behind me. I would like to thank AFI Docs for the invitation to moderate this discussion. Just to let folks know, we have an ASL interpreter with us, so we are going to attempt to speak slowly and clearly. So I have three panelists here with me I'm very excited about. We have Whitney Skauge, who is an award-winning filmmaker dedicated to diverse storytelling and representation. Their films act as an extension of social and political activism with hopes of helping audiences understand themselves and the world around them better. Their latest short film, The Beauty President, debuted at the South by Southwest Film Festival in 2021. Let's give it up for Whitney. Next, we have Adam. Adam Baran's work focuses on hidden histories of queer sexuality. Baran produced the Emmy-nominated Netflix documentary Circus of Books, which was awesome, and wrote and directed the award-winning gay narrative short Jackpot. He is a producer on director Michael Labenlove's new doc series, How to Have Sex in a Pandemic, which premiered on Vimeo on June 22nd. Baran has served as the co-curator of the acclaimed queer art film screening series since 2009. His next project explores the history of the New York-based gay leather group, the 9+ Club. So let's give it up for Adam. And last but not least, we have Vivian Kleiman, who is a Peabody Award-winning filmmaker whose work is noted for its cultural and stylistic diversity, a longtime collaborator with Black gay filmmaker Marlon Riggs. Her credits include his landmark documentary, Tongues Untied. Kleiman was nominated for a National Emmy Award for Outstanding Individual Achievement for her work with Riggs on color adjustment. All right, big round of applause for everyone. Okay, so folks, let's get started. We are going to start with playing all three clips for these filmmakers.
Our thing was visibility. I mean, we were still being beaten up. We were dying from AIDS. We were being denied jobs and housing, and and the more visible we made ourselves, the less that happened.
There was every combination of guys there, from workers, delivery boys, shop workers, executives, tourists, random dads.
But it was pretty hot because it was a mixed crowd of like Jewish men and yarmulkes and Black and Latin and Asian blue-collar guys.
And it was completely anonymous. For the more in the know, there were other, more private restrooms, and in those tea rooms, there'd often be more leisurely fucking and sucking going on.
Everybody wanted to be with the Wall Street men because they had so much money. That's why one of the biggest cruising areas was the 12th floor of the World Trade Center. Back then, you didn't have to sign in, so it was quite easy to go into the World Trade Center. The best way to do it would be dressed in a suit. I walked into the elevator, went up to the 12th floor. I walked into the restroom. and there was like 12 guys, all getting blowjobs. There were a couple of guys getting fucked, and all the time everybody was in suits, which made it even hotter. There were 3 occasions I did that, and all 3 occasions I walked in and it was just like, it was that way. It was wild.
When you're drawing yourself, you can draw yourself however you want. Comics is a media that's so friendly to a queer author.
I had no idea that I was going to be part of such a big adventure.
I experienced a lot in the gay community as an African American. I'm using this as an opportunity to talk about these things that we should be addressing.
To know that these are like the footsteps that we're walking in. For this like generation, that's something I don't want to ever forget.
My favorite part of the process is when the pencil is all finished and I haven't inked it yet.
Why is that your favorite?
Because it still has the possibility of perfection. I haven't fucked anything up yet.
I hope everyone had a chance to watch the films. I definitely enjoyed all of them. So I'm going to start the conversation with Whitney. So Whitney, I thought that was the Beauty President was such a great portrait, totally charming personality. I love the humor and the insights that Terrence brought. And I love, the quote, if Ronald Reagan, who's a bad actor, can be elected for president, why not a good drag queen? I thought it would, and, that he had such an ingenious way of getting into the Democratic convention. And then, your film dealt with, obviously, AIDS, and Terrence talks about that in terms of like switching military and educational, the government budget, which I thought was, really great way to think about it. So tell us, how did this film come to be? Did you know Terrence? How did that all start?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much. And thank you to AFI Docs for having all of us here today. It's an honor to be here. So I work for a company called Breakwater Studios, and we were doing research for a different series. And at the time, I was asked to help do research, and I came across an article that basically said drag queen runs for president in 1992. And I was like, well, what is this? I have to dig deeper. As a queer person and as a politically minded person, it was just like, wow, what is this? So I did some digging, and I ended up, learning about Terrence and what he did. And I presented the research to our team, and it got denied. It did not get picked up for the series that I was doing research for. And so I was like, okay, that's fine. But I just could not stop thinking about Terrence, and I could not stop thinking about his story. And then lo and behold, the archival that's in the film, I found online. There's all this VHS footage of, like you mentioned, the Democratic National Convention, his campaign speech. And so once I found the footage, I was just like, well, this has to be a film. And then I went back to my boss, now colleague, and I said, more or less, if you don't want to do it, can I do it? And thankfully, they said yes. And I found Terrence through his lawyer, and he's up in San Francisco. And I just pitched the project to him, and he was very gracious. He wanted to share his story, and we felt like we kind of had this relationship. I reminded him of some of his friends. He reminds me of some of my family. And so it was just this really beautiful way just to have a conversation. So that's kind of a little bit backstory on that.
That's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. And I think that that's really actually important that you decided to pursue, this idea once you found a little bit about it. And also, like you said, it's really great that your company said yes to the project. I know the Ford Foundation released a report last fall in September called Beyond Inclusion. And it basically essentially talks about the fact that for the field, in terms of diversity, inclusion, and equity, that we really, that there needs to be an investment into BIPOC filmmakers, right? To really shift the needle. So I'm really glad that your film is out there. So it's screened at South by Southwest. Has it, talk a little bit about, audience reactions?
I think there's this reaction of instantly, why didn't I know about this? And that's the same reaction I had. And especially as a queer person and as a Black person, you really start to understand that there's so much we don't know. And I think a lot of people have this reaction of almost being a little angry that they don't know this history and feeling a little, it's like this interesting mixture of feeling bad, but feeling angry. And like, it just kind of, I think representation is so important. And when you're not getting that content, it's such a loss and it's such a hole. And so when you find something that can fill that, I think it's this burst of emotion that happens. And I think in terms of audience reactions, it's really just admiring Terrence and saying that, why isn't he in our history books? Why don't I know about this person? And I think, my whole goal with making the film was to honor Terrence and to get him in the spotlight and to get him his due time that I feel and many other people feel has not been given to him. So I think in terms of, the audience watching it, it's just propelling this idea that we really do need these stories and audiences are going to react well to them and audiences do need this content. Film, not content. But yeah, I mean, it's been great. It's been great. And it's been a really lovely festival ride.
That's awesome. Yes. And I totally agree. I think that when we are so hungry for representation, and then when we see something, sometimes we want it to, to address all of our needs, right? And I think that really, if anything, it lets us know that we really need lots of different stories. We need lots of just really across the board so that we're not looking for one film to have to, have it all, right? So that we can see this film and say, okay, it's sort of excavating this one piece, this one portrait, right? And then we'll have another and another, that will sort of tell the range of the stories. So yeah, absolutely. And I love the humor, and I think it's a perfect pick in terms of, the character. Can you talk a little bit about what your favorite moment was in making this film? One of your favorite moments?
I've got to say, I feel like the film and in my editing, I really hit a stride with the D&C section. I think, when he is talking about the fact that he had to change in the men's bathroom and then, the knock on the door and there's a man in here. Like, I think Terrence, kind of has this humor as almost a sense of armor. And I think that humor allows him to get himself in situations that might actually not be safe. And he can massage the situation in such a way where his humor and his charm just flows out of him. And I think once you see him as Joan Jett Black get on the floor, you're just like, of course you did this. Like, and I just love how he takes us through that whole story, starting from realizing that was not a place for him, yet he had an initiative and he needed to do this for his community. And just walking through that whole section was just so fun to play with and so fun to edit. And, really with the film, it's trying to honor the past while seeing him in the present. And so that section was just so fun to edit.
Absolutely. And I think that it's so important also talking about honoring, you know, our heroes, you know, our queer heroes, particularly our queer people of color heroes, especially when they're still alive, right? And not waiting until they've passed to talk about, you know, their impact or their legacy. So yeah, I think it's such a beautiful portrait. So I'm going to move on to Adam next, and we'll come back around. Adam, so Trade Center, cruising in New York City, specifically within the World Trade Center, and you know, your film talks about how it, you know, cruising was impacted by 9/11, you know, in 2001, and it, you know, weaves in voices from 5 gay men who shared their experiences. And I love how you brought in the archival footage with the current day footage and how that was combined. It gave a really experimental feel and experimental quality to the film. And I love the score too. So can you talk about how your film came to be?
Sure. Well, thanks for your compliments. I really appreciate them. I have been one of my longest friends in New York is a wonderful guy named Billy Miller, who's an editor of an amazing magazine called Straight to Hell, which for much of the 70s and 80s and 90s and right up until the 2000s collected true stories of gay men's sexuality, sexual experiences, often not just between exclusively gay men, but between gay men and straight men and other people along the spectrum of sexuality. And Billy had written an essay for a book that another pair of friends put out called Petite Mort, Recollections of a Queer Public. And this essay was essentially Billy's guide to all the queer cruising spots at the World Trade Center. And that idea really kind of rooted around in my brain for almost a decade, with me just trying to figure out, like, I'd really love to tell that story one day, but I'm not really sure how. And I was at MoMA, and I was watching restorations of the legendary gay pornographer Fred Halstead's films, LA Plays Itself and Sex Tool. And both of them feature a lot of scenes of sort of characters walking around landscapes and listening to stories on the soundtrack. And I started to think about, you know, landscape films, experimental cinema, a lot of which I was watching during the pandemic. And right before everything shut down, we went and just basically did 2 days kind of going almost as a tourist to the World Trade Center and touring around the various spaces, and with my DP kind of taking secret footage, you know, that we were just seen as tourists, but we were really kind of trying to capture what was there now. And when I went to construct a film with my editor, Colin Fitzpatrick, you know, I think I really wanted to, we almost didn't have any archival footage in. We have some at the beginning, but other than that, there really isn't any. And that is really by design. I really wanted to make the audience hear the richness and the excitement of all these spaces just via audio, but visually not really be able to get back to that place and to, you know, see how these spaces, you know, are completely corporatized, you know, have been turned into a sort of a tourist mall and, you know, a sort of a ride, you know, a memorial, and go up to the observation deck, and, you know, all these sort of things that are very much designed to kind of collect money, and how that mirrors a lot of the changes that happened in New York post 9/11. The gentrification everywhere really impacted people. And, you know, for me, I think it's really important to record the stories of elders, and especially stories of sexuality and a lot of these secret histories, because they were just so completely written out of our history, even by other gay people who, you know, don't want to kind of acknowledge some of the messy truths that we don't want necessarily straight people to know, that we, you know, like to go cruising in bathrooms or in sex clubs or things like that. But it's important for people to understand that, you know, the history is such that some of those spaces were kind of the only spaces that people could meet, to find each other and to interact in a cross-class, cross-generational way. And so, so we worked on the film throughout the pandemic and, finished it up, and it's been a good success. We premiered also at South by Southwest with Whitney's film, and the reaction has been really, really positive.
That's awesome. And, with the voices that are telling the stories, can you talk a little bit about how those whether how you came to select those stories or those voices?
Sure. Well, so Billy's story he's the main narrator in the piece, and you hear him a little bit at the end of that clip, at the beginning of that clip when that we showed earlier. And his story was sort of presented almost as though if you were a tour guide, here's this space and here's that space. And then, when I started to construct it, I thought, well, you're a documentarian, you have a baseline and you have footage, but you also have evidence. And so supplementary evidence and stories are needed to corroborate the, experiences of one person rather than it just being one person's experience. Right. I want people to hear from some different people. And so I, basically started reaching out to my friend group, friends of friends, looking for people I knew who were kind of elders, and not necessarily even elders, because some of the people in the film aren't particularly old, but they were around in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, and they experienced the cruising spaces at those spaces, and have memories there. So, and nobody's ever asked them about these memories. So during the pandemic, the first month, 2 months was just really about trying to collect these stories and figure out what in their stories gave, additional weight to the original story that I was basing the film on.
And I think that, I'm not sure if you've recorded more stories, but that these 5 work really well together and really built on each other. And like you said, it really reveals this side of gay life that, we don't hear much about, even within queer history. And I think it's really because, again, it's, we, even as queers, we get stereotyped, and, you have to be this kind of very respectable queer, versus that kind of a queer. And, that is what is palatable to the larger society sometimes. So I think that it's so important that these stories are shared. And that, we're not shying away from the sucking and the fucking.
Absolutely. I mean, it's all linked in with respectability politics. And, I'm doing lots of research for my project now, all about the 50s and 60s, the homophile movement. And, what's super interesting looking at magazines from 1970 is, that the people in print are acknowledging that, drag queens, trans people, femme, genderqueer presenting folks essentially were the ones who fought back at Stonewall and other previous riots. But the people organizing the first Gay Pride March, it's Gay Pride weekend here in New York, didn't want drag queens to come to the first march. They were afraid of that being the only representation that straight society saw. And, the cruising and the sexuality and these things that, and drag and the way of presenting itself were very, not how a big portion of the community wanted to be presented. So I think, looking at Whitney's amazing film too, there's a lot of that history is in there too, about stories and people we'd rather avoid, we'd rather not have out being the most visible people in our world. And so much of what we do as documentarians is trying to break through that and show how those stories are much more complicated and much more common than we think.
Absolutely. And with that, moving on to Vivian, queer history. And we have a film about, the origin, the evolution of queer comics. And it features huge superstars. I mean, Ellison Bechdel, Jennifer Camper, Howard Cruz, Rupert Kinnaird, Mary Wings. I love how, we sort of, it's a walk through history. There's talk about censorship and the Comic Code Authority. We talk about AIDS and aging. I have to say, I love the animation. It's perfectly aligned with the comics. It's beautifully done. I mean, the panels are beautiful, and I love learning about the artistry behind the comics, the shading, the pens that were used, the anchor panels and the emotions. And I have to say, the sound design, the music was so seamless and so on point. It's like, it's right there when it needs to be. Beautifully done. So congratulations. So Vivian, how did No Straight Lines come to be?
The genesis of the film, well, first of all, thank you to AFI for having all of us in the festival and for pivoting to bringing us together through the age of the pandemic. The film started when I was approached by a friend and colleague, Greg Sirota, who had started to work on the project with a colleague of his, a friend of his, Justin Hall, who's an expert in the subject of queer comics. And Justin had edited the first anthology of queer comics, No Straight Lines is the name of the book, as well as the film. They encouraged me to go and attend the world's first in-gathering of Queers in Comics conference that was taking place in New York in 2015. I went with not the highest of expectations. And when I walked into that room that first morning, I was overwhelmed. Here was this conference hall that, contrary to the stereotype of the grumpy artist, this was a room filled with an amazing variety of people, from the young person with chartreuse colored hair standing there talking with an older gentleman, balded head, buttoned down Ivy League collared shirt, surrounded by an incredible variety of people. I mean, talk about intersectionality. It was everybody. And, I was just transfixed, really, by the notion of the sense of connection, the sense of community, the sense of respect and care for one another. As I started to listen to some of the panels that were presented over the next few days, one story after the other was incredible. The artwork was amazing. Talk about a filmmaker's dream, a plethora of visuals. So the challenge of this film, at the end of that 3-day conference, it was on the one hand a casting director's dream to have these incredible people, incredible stories, powerful storytellers, wonderful images. At the same time, it was a challenge, because how do you boil that down into a cohesive narrative that won't just be a didactic chronology, won't just be an encyclopedia, first this, then that, then the other. I wasn't going to waste my time on such a project. I was going for, I wanted to create a film that I would have liked to have had when I was a young lesbian coming out. And I wanted something that was not just going to teach queer history, or not just teach about this subculture in our community, but that would invite the viewer on some kind of an emotional journey. And complementing to what Adam was speaking about in terms of nuance, a representation of who we are, not just having the GQ gentleman presented in the film. I wanted to tell a history that was much more nuanced and much more inclusive and much more complicated and much messier. And that's what I set out to do.
And I think you succeeded. I mean, it's a really, it's a beautiful collection. It's like you mentioned, that community, that sense of community that we are a part of. And it was really actually very heartening to hear some of the younger comic artists, younger not necessarily in age, but maybe newer to the art form, talking about knowing their history and you having you include them in your film. I think it really demonstrated that range and demonstrated that sense of inclusive community that you were talking about. Yeah, so I think you had 2 DPs working with you, is that right? And sorry, you had 2 editors, actually. You worked with 2 editors. Can you talk a little bit about, the making of the film? Were you always a comic book fan? I mean, you were invited into this project, tell us more.
Well, first of all, part of the backstory is that one of the artists, Rupert Kennard, used to live in Oakland, California, and he was a friend of my pal, Marlon Riggs. So I knew Rupert from way back, and I knew of him as an artist and mostly a graphic designer, but also knew of his creative work. And actually, Rupert had done some drawings that Marlon used in Tongues Untied of snapology. So there was a braiding of past and present within my own personal life and career. The process of working on the film, as many long format documentaries, you raise some money, you spend it, you go back to earn some money, you write proposals, and then so on and so forth. The cycle repeats itself. So it was done over a long period of time. And in terms of the DP, the director of photography, I was very much committed to spending extra money to bring the same visual sensibility of the DP on each shoot. And so Andy Black was present and brought the knowledge of the process and the subject and our shared visual aesthetic to each location. The editing started with Linda Peckham here in Berkeley, California. Her office was not far from mine at the Fantasy Film Building. And then COVID hit. And one thing led to another, and Linda was no longer available to work on the project. We stopped for a little while. And when it came time to start in again, I was very lucky to connect with Christian Badgley, who had worked with me on a much earlier project, and also had worked with Marlon on some of his works and completed his final film, Black Is, Black Ain't. By that point, though, Christian Badgley, known fondly as Badge, was living in South France. And so we worked remotely for about a half a year. And through the joy of technology, it worked pretty well, I'd have to say. There was a little bit of loss of not being in the same room together, of not sitting side by side. But hey, if she had lived a few blocks away, we still would have worked remotely during the thick of shelter in place. So in the end, I think there was an accrual of different talents, like you were saying, the animation done by Suzanne Slatcher, a former Pixar artist, Linda, Badge, Justin. It was really an accrual of a lot of talented people.
It's an amazing project. And I hear you about the fundraising. I did not know that there was a Comic Code Authority. And when I heard that, in your documentary, it reminded me of the Motion Picture Production Code, which came about in 1930. And basically, it controls, it evolved into the MPAA system, but it essentially controlled, or I should say, it was intended to uphold the sanctity of white heterosexual Christian marriage in film, right? And there was a whole list of things that you can show and cannot show, including things like misogyny or white slavery. Like, these are things that you're not allowed to show, and the film industry knew we needed, lots of conflict, and of course, gay characters were part of that conflict. But and that's the reason why so many gay films from the 30s, even all the way up to the 70s and 80s, all our queer characters always were dead by the end of the film, right? And that's the reason why we were always dead. So it's really interesting for me to learn that there was a similar comic code authority. Can you talk a little bit more about that and how it maybe impacted, the history of comics, queer comics specifically?
Yeah, Madeleine, I actually had the exact same reaction as you. When I stumbled on that theme, I immediately thought of the motion picture code as well. And yeah, I think they both reflect values that dominant, culture was trying to impose on all of us for better, or nothing better about it, for worse. But I also think it's kind of curious because, the stereotype of comics is that, oh, it's kid stuff. And yet the authority, that Comics Code authority speaks directly to the notion that they had been very much an adult genre. And they definitely put a kibosh on free speech, but then the 60s came along, and there was the underground comics found a home in alternative places, like in the adult bookstores, the adult world. And it kind of was as an emergence from the underground comic scene, where queer artists were marginalized, even in the marginalized world of underground comics, that our voices started to get raised until we have then finally the 1970s and the start of our own kind of community institutions of bookstores and coffee houses and newspapers and all that wonderful stuff.
Right. There is a question, and I'll just kind of transition over to some of the questions that are coming in. There is a question for you, Vivian, from Malik. Vivian mentioning thinking about her perspective as a young lesbian coming out, and they are interested to hear about what these kinds of stories or films meant to the panelists when you were younger. I think this might have been when you said, like as a young lesbian, you would have liked to see a film like this. What would have meant to you?
Yeah, well, the queer comics have arrived at such an amazing place now that I hesitated to respond. I was trying to think of where to grab onto in the notion of the history of queer comics, how to respond to that interesting question. What the amazing thing about queer comics is that it started off as a DIY art form, do it yourself. All you needed was a pencil and a piece of paper. And as a result, the image making was very rich, and you could do anything. You could be humorous, you could be angry, you could have great drawing skills, you could just draw scratchy figures. And we were also thirsty just for images of ourselves. And the notion of self-representation is very important today. And it was also very important for me as a young lesbian coming out. So for me, looking forward to Alison Bechdel's images on a regular, I think it was every other week, they were serialized in the women's newspaper Plexus here in the Bay Area. It was a joy. It was a joy to have our own experiences there, and also to have the range, as I said, the range of experiences, not just superhero, not just, Batman and, Superman and Wonder Woman, but to have the complexity of our experiences included, for me was really liberating.
And I totally remember those comic strips, it's sort of like, hey, that was something I went through, or that's something, my housemates are talking about, or, whatever we're going through. And it's really that everyday experiences, your everyday experiences being reflected back, right? In a way that is, much larger, which I think felt really affirming. So I am going to include and start to move around with these questions. This is to the panel from Arthur Sinclair, all of your films explore these amazing excavated histories, mostly involving people who are still with us. How do we get more attention paid to our living heroes and elders? What advice do you have for others who want to tell these stories before they are gone? What are some things to avoid? That's a lot of questions. I'm going to start with Whitney. Any thoughts about this?
Yeah, I would just say in terms of, how do we collect more of these stories? I think something that's really important is to be curious. Be curious about your history, be curious about your community, and act on that. I think it's really easy to see things and be like, oh, that was cool. But I think really taking that next step to preserve in whatever format or medium you're working in. I think there's so many different ways to preserve things. So really just being curious and then taking that curiosity and, finding a way to utilize it. And then I guess, maybe things to avoid is I don't think it's this idea that, it's only for elders. I think there's a lot happening in the younger queer community right now. I think there's a lot happening with the Gen Z community. We're seeing more and more people come out, and what is that all about? So I think it's just being curious in terms of the whole queer community, because it's all happening right now. So yeah, I would just say curiosity is key.
Thank you. Adam, your thoughts on this?
Sure. Well, I think that I come from a tradition as a someone who was raised Jewish. We're taught about the Shoah and the importance of recording, the impulse to record all the stories of people who survived the Holocaust or lost family members in the Holocaust, and that these are all really important stories to collect. And so I think that, there is no wrong way of going about collecting these stories. If you know somebody and you're friends with them and they're an elder, or they're not, or they just have a fabulous story, sit them down and have them tell the story, even if it's just in your phone as a voice memo, because, when you look at, for instance, I look at something that really honors and uplifts our heroes and elders, but many of them are not still around, is Eric Marcus's podcast, Making Gay History. And, he recorded all these incredible interviews with all these pioneering, gay rights people, and many of whom, their stories explore the complexities of the gay movement and the pressures and the they were not perfect people too. I think that's important that we look at people and say, some of them did flawed things or took flawed actions, but try to understand why and what that involved. And I'm doing the project I'm doing right now, which is about, leather clubs in New York City in private spaces. I'm sort of looking at it from a lens of masculinity and the construct of masculinity and butch male masculinity, and how that was both positive and had negatives for everyone. So I think, however you can collect these stories, whether or not it's on your phone or, with your camera or with a professional crew, if you're interested in it, I think that people should follow their impulses and take time to interview those people, take time to let them tell their stories in whatever way they feel comfortable.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Adam. Vivian, you worked with Marlon Riggs through several projects, and since his passing, all those films are really his legacy. It's part of his legacy and your legacy too. And so your thoughts on this question.
I actually appreciate what Adam just said about not just accolade of people that you are admiring, but to present them as real folks, as Adam said, with flaws, not so hagiographic. And I also love the notion that we are speaking about having access. We have phones that we can use to record. We have great technology. We have examples of the importance of recording what's going on around us with George Floyd. History was changed by a little cell phone and somebody having the genius to stay there and record it. I think one thing that I'd like to see is a repository for all these stories, or maybe multiple repositories that get links, so that, if when Whitney wants to go do another film, some of these materials will be available for future filmmakers and installation artists to take advantage of. So that, I'd say, not just leaving it on your cell. I guess I would disagree with Adam. Don't just leave it on your cell phone, but let's try to think of a way where we can have a repository for queer stories.
Absolutely. And moving on to another question from Tammy. Were there other stories that you discovered that you did not expect to find when shooting? And was there anything you wish that you could have kept that ended up on the cutting room floor? Vivian, you want to start?
Oh Lord, so many stories that didn't make it, and so many people. As I said earlier, the hardest part was deciding who to leave, who to put in, and who would have to be left out. I think if there was something I wish I could have done more, is more stories of what's going on today. I talked about it being a do-it-yourself art form in the beginning. And curiously enough, it's once again a do-it-yourself art form with web comics and webisodes, and it's a world that's exploding. And I'd like to add that the cartoon artists I spoke with said, in the beginning, everybody knew each other. All the queer, cartoon artists knew each other because it was a small universe. And now with the internet, it's everywhere, and it's even more accessible, and it's completely international, and no longer do folks know each other. And in fact, there are queer comics that certain artists don't like. You get to choose. You get to say, no, I don't care for sci-fi. I only want to have these stories of fuzzy animals, whatever. So it's a huge universe of material that did not make its way into film.
Let's go to Adam.
Well, I wish that I had, there was only one story that didn't make it into my film that I really liked, which was about one of the porn shops that was in the kind of campus on the edge of the World Trade Center that men used to go to. And it just took us out of the actual campus of the World Trade Center slightly, and it felt like every time we were trying to make it work, it lost a little bit of the sort of the tour guide quality. But I do want to end up using that story in something else, maybe about porn shop culture and what have you. Once the film was started to be written about, and articles got posted on certain gay sites and whatnot, I started to read in the comment section. There were people who would say, oh yeah, I knew about this place, or I would go to this place, and there was stuff I didn't even know about. So, if I ever expanded out into a feature, I feel like I could tell a lot more stories, and there'd be a lot more gag inducing tales that I think people would find really, really interesting.
Cool. And Whitney, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I tried to do a really focused story. So I can't say that there's anything that I wish was in the film. There's certain lines that I love, but they just didn't fit into that central narrative. And so, we do really long interviews. I have about a 10, 12-hour long interview with Terrence. So there's loads of things that are still, on the table. Something that I'm just really interested in exploring in future work is the intersectionality between Blackness and queerness. And that's something that Terrence touches on a bit, where, in both communities you struggle. And both communities, there is a lack of understanding and there's a lack of representation. And how does that all fit together? So Terrence has this great line where he talks about how his family bought themselves out of slavery. And so therefore he comes from a family that doesn't deal with bullshit. And so it's kind of this whole other side of Terrence's story that has potential. But I'm really happy with the film that we have. So that's my thought.
And just on that, I mean, I think that there's, you know, there can be multiple portraits, right, that explore that intersection of being Black and queer, you know, and I think that there's space for that. And I think what these personal stories do, you know, from your film and Adam's film and Vivian's film, is that we put a face to many of these political issues, right? Because sometimes, you know, as you know, politics gets very, you know, it's this or that, it's right or wrong, you know, and when we put faces to these issues, right, that's when we really understand, you know, their humanity and that we're talking about another human person, right? And I think that that's when we start to really connect. So very important to talk about those intersections. And, you know, and we're not one issue, you know, a group of community people, you know, we're not a single issue community. So our lives are complex. And I think that we actually possess the ability, because of that, we, you know, because we're navigating all of these different spaces constantly, we possess the ability to really think about multiple things as a whole, right, to navigate through life. And you know, I'm realizing that a lot of folks don't have that ability or that skill. It really is a hard skill, you know. So let's see, we have a few more minutes, and I wanted to ask, you know, what do you hope the viewer walks away with? Whitney, you want to start?
Absolutely. I think for me, it's really just this understanding that everyone has a voice, everyone's voice matters, everyone can make space for themselves. And I think for queer audiences specifically, it's this understanding that we have always been here. We've always been here politically. And so really, I just hope that, you know, people feel a call to action in some regard after watching the film, whatever that means for you, just really understanding that, you know, it's cliche, but our voices do matter. And I think that, you know, Terrence's story shows that even if it wasn't recognized in the mainstream at the time that it happened, it has a huge impact on people that you don't even realize. Something that Terrence talks about all the time is that, you know, it was something that he just did. He just, you know, he did it. And it was 30 years ago and he stopped thinking about it. And now all these young people are starting to come to him to be like, no, that was a really big deal. And so I think it's just this understanding that however small it seems to you, it's going to have a really big impact to other people.
For sure. Adam.
Well, I think that, you know, I hope people walk away from my film thinking a little bit about gentrification and disaster capitalism and some of these concepts that, you know, can be applied to the queer community in a variety of ways. I think, you know, I'm really appreciative that the stories in the press that have come out and the reactions about my film have steered away from this sort of like, ooh, tee-hee, there was sex going on in bathrooms, and is really more seriously looking at the idea of like, well, why did that culture exist and how do these things proliferate? And what does it mean that this whole ecosystem of queer sex and secret sex spaces existed alongside one of the, you know, biggest monuments to capital and commerce and New York City in its representation. And just in general, when you go around the world, you know, as somebody who looks at histories of sexuality, you find that, you know, in, you know, plazas in Moscow and places in Havana, you know, there are these spaces that get carved out by queer people to be able to interact with each other, whether sexually or socially. And they are often really marginalized and dangerous and, you know, subcultural spaces. And I hope that people think about a little bit more what that means and why those places develop, and how there is an importance to those places in our lives, and that it's not just a giggly sort of, you know, thing. It's actually about we built up and found each other.
Mm-hmm. That's right. It's really all about that because, you know, I mean, if you go back in history, we were not allowed to congregate in many spaces, right? And that is, you know, and that was sort of how some of these spaces came to be because we were not allowed our own space to gather, you know, definitely. Vivian, what would you like the viewer to walk away with?
Yeah, well, you know, as I said earlier, I really did this film for young people. I did, in particular, I did it for for queer youth. And especially for everybody out there who's struggling with self-acceptance. You know, queer comics made our lives visible, continue to do so. And one thing I'd like to mention here in the time we have is that part of what motivated me to do this is a statistic. It turns out that a disproportionate number of queer youth attempt suicide relative to their peers. And for me, that's really horrifying at a time when we feel that we've achieved so much. You know, we can congregate, we have spaces if we choose. And yet there's so much violence against trans, especially trans people of color. And if I can offer something that's going to inspire people to feel seen and to feel like they have heard stories of folks who have faced obstacles and overcome them, that perhaps there might even be some who will be inspired to use the film as inspiration to take up some creative, you know, output. I would love that.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And, you know, that is such a beautiful note to end on. And thank you, all three of you, for your inspiring films. Vivian, Whitney, Adam, thank you so much. It has been a joy to be in conversation with you, and good luck with your current run, festival run, and good luck with future projects. Thanks everyone for joining us.
Thank you, Madeleine.